Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, the Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I want to welcome you to our second Faculty Research Colloquium for the fall 2021 semester. I want to give special thanks to Dominique Francesca, who is the Business Manager for the Center for Humanities, and to Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, for their work in organizing this event. Today, we are very delighted to have with us Professor Natalia Mielczarek. She will be presenting on images and messages, lives of pictures beyond publication. Dr. Natalia Mielczarek is an assistant professor of visual communication in the School of Communication at Virginia Tech. Her research interests include visual rhetoric, iconicity, internet memes, and appropriation of images in remixed culture. She's currently working on a study about visual archetypal characters in editorial cartoons published after the 2020 US presidential election. She teaches a mix of undergraduate and graduate courses, including workshops on journalistic reporting, writing, and multimedia storytelling. And she also teaches a seminar on images and their signification powers. Professor Mielczarek spent 10 years working as a newspaper reporter before returning to a career in academia. We're very excited to have you with us, Professor Mielczarek, so please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson, for this lovely introduction. And thank you also for this opportunity, and big thanks to those of you who are joining us this afternoon. So the title of my presentation today really sums up the central question that has been driving my work, and that is, what happens to meanings and functions of images after their public debut, so after their publication. And we know from a quite sizable body of scholarship in visual communication, and also from our own experiences, that images rarely end their lives at publication. In fact, in digital participatory culture, in which we're both consumers and producers at the same time, the lives of images get extended. And I guess we could also talk about reincarnation of these images as they get manipulated, reconfigured, shared and reshared online over and over. And so today, what I'd like to do is walk us through some of these dynamics and their consequences with the help of two case studies that I've worked on. So I will talk about those in a second. Before we do that, I do want to make a quick distinction between functions and purposes of images. You hear me talk about functions. So in visual rhetoric, some scholars make that distinction to privilege different parties involved in interpretation, I guess, of those images. A purpose of an image is the intention that the author gives to an image upon creation. So let's say if I put together a poster and say that this is a campaign poster for candidate X to do Y and Z, that is the purpose for that image that I, as the author, give it. Functions actually are produced really by the users of the artifacts. So it is the audience who uses images that function in certain ways. And for my scholarship, that is the more interesting question, no offense to artists and authors and their motivations. So anyway, so the two case studies that I would like us to look at to see the transformations in images and their functions and meanings bring us back to 2015 and the refugee crisis in Europe, and then the other case study gets us back to 2018 and the US-Mexico border. And so I'm going to share my screen right now so we can actually look at the images of interest. So just bear with me. I hope you can see the slides. So as I mentioned, the first case study takes us to Europe in 2015, where more than 1.3 million refugees, primarily from Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, made their way through the Mediterranean Sea in makeshift boats or inflatable boats. And you can see some of the images from some of these journeys, overcrowded, very dangerous conditions. And as we know from news reports, some of these journeys did not end well. One of such trips ended in tragedy for the Kurdi family that traveled from Syria with two little boys, including Alan Kurdi, who was 3 years old, and his 5-year-old brother, and then the parents. And their boat apparently capsized in the Mediterranean, and the two little boys and their mother perished in the water. And what you see, you probably recognize this image that became an instant news icon that shows the body, the lifeless body of the 3-year-old boy, face down in a surf on a Turkish beach, being discovered by Turkish authorities. This happened on September 2nd, 2015. And so this image went viral and became sort of the image of the plight of refugees in Europe. And so Alan Kurdi, the little boy, became a metonym. So he became sort of the face, for lack of a better description, of the crisis of refugees in Europe. He also became a hashtag, and the one that I'm showing you is in Turkish. That was the original hashtag that translates into humanity washed ashore. And he also became an internet meme. And it is that third articulation of Alan Kurdi that I'd like to talk about today. And just to briefly review, a meme here is understood as a collection of self-referential images that get manipulated as they proliferate the internet. So in other words, it's a collection of images that use the same photographic template, but they manipulate either the content or the context of the original to produce new meanings as they circulate online. So there were dozens and dozens of internet memes of Alan Kurdi, but a group of a few actually stood out to me because of their funerary character, I would say. They seem to eulogize the boy and reimagine the end of his life. And what you're seeing now are example of some of these memes. So here you can see Alan as an angel who takes off the beach and is headed elsewhere. Here we have him being picked up by an angel from the beach. Here he, again, as an angel, is being lifted up by the hands of God to heaven. Here, a little more gruesome, a little more sober portrayal of the boy lying in a shallow grave. Whereas here, in the same position, he's being reimagined as just sleeping on a blanket on the beach, surrounded by toys, in what the caption suggests, a better place. So one of the more popular memes that circulated, especially on Twitter, was this one, prepared by a Turkish artist, Ömer Tosun, with a caption, quote, "I am only dreaming of what could have been. I think this expresses what a shame it is." So here we see the little boy lying in a child's room. So he is being decontextualized from the original image. So he's no longer on the beach, you know, where the waves slap at his face. He's now tucked in, well, not really tucked in because he's actually uncovered, but he's ensconced in his little bed in the room, so no longer on the beach. And so that means that he's being not only decontextualized, but also recontextualized, so plugged in to a very different scenario than the one that we saw a couple of slides ago. Here he is asleep, so presumably he is alive. We see a mobile hanging above him. We see a soft moonlight coming in. So a very serene scene, very different from the original one that introduced Alan KURDI to the world. But as you can tell, there is a visual dissonance produced by two visual signifiers that get also transported from the beach scene. And that is the initial death pose that you can see. Yes, he's asleep, but he is still in the pose in which he was originally found on the beach. And he's also wearing his death outfit. So the meme sort of places this boy in this in-between place where he's neither dead nor alive, but at least he's no longer on the beach. The second one that circulated prominently online, especially on Twitter, is this one, where we see pretty overt religious and more specifically Christian symbolism, where Alan again is decontextualized because he's no longer lying face down on the beach. Here he is what looks like presumably heaven. And it is in fact a scene of biblical proportions as he is recontextualized into a miracle of walking on water with Jesus. So the meme not only resurrects this boy, again, lifting him from the beach, but it also grants him eternal life. So what I propose here is that as the original iconic image continues its life through internet memes, those memes renegotiate Alan's story, at least the end of his story, by not only resurrecting him, but also immortalizing him. And in some cases of these memes, I would suggest that they also frame him as a martyr who perished in pursuit of a better life. So taken together, these visual artifacts with their captions and some commentary online, I argue bring symbolic, of course, justice to the little boy by reimagining the end of his life. They symbolically and literally in these drawings take him off the beach and put him in sort of the better life scenarios that they imagine for him. For some of the viewers, it's pretty obvious, again, from the commentary and some of the captions, that these memes function as almost visual atonement to the collectively felt, I don't want to say guilt, but remorse for such a tragic and publicly tragic ending of that boy. So let's now go back in time, in this case study, to 2018, to the US-Mexico border and the events that unfolded there, when in 2018, in April, the Trump administration announced enforcement of the family separation policy that would separate children from the families who entered the United States through illegal means. And I'm sure you've seen iterations of this photograph where we have families carrying whatever they could carry with kids trying to enter the country. Here, some scenes from inside the detention centers. These are actually provided by the US Customs and Border Protection, of parents standing in the background and then kids being contained in what some people called cages, because they look like cages, but they are spaces within the detention centers that keep these immigrant and refugee children separated from their parents. As you also probably recall, these images evoked outrage in some politicians from both countries, in child welfare advocates, immigration and refugee advocates, celebrities, psychologists, and regular people, some of whom made pretty striking parallels between the scenes unfolding in detention centers and scenes from Nazi concentration camps. One of the people who was vocal about those parallels was the former CIA director Michael Hayden, who tweeted, quote, "Other governments have separated mothers and children," of course, alluding to the Nazi regime. And he attached a picture of the main entrance to the most notorious Nazi concentration and extermination camp in Auschwitz. In a span of less than a month, more than 2,000 immigrant and refugee children were separated from their families on the southern border. And of course, that number went up as the enforcement of the policy continued. The separation and the reactions to that enforcement of the policy continued through different visual means, including editorial cartoons. And so for this project, I looked at a little over 100 editorial cartoons that addressed this issue in a span of a few months. And an overwhelming majority of them cited or expressed sympathies toward the families and especially children, and very much criticized the Trump administration for such a, what was perceived as brutal enforcement of the policy. So what you're looking at are just a few examples of pretty typical cartoons from that time. But of course, several of them caught my attention because, again, they were different from the majority. And that is because they also alluded to the Nazi times to talk about the current crisis on the border. And for us to really understand these echoes that I argue are present in these cartoons, I just want to run through several iconic visual signifiers of the Holocaust so you can understand what I am alluding to. If you've ever visited any former camp that serves still as a museum and a memorial, you probably saw piles of different artifacts. Here we see piles of shoes, but there are also piles of glasses and suitcases and artificial limbs and, of course, hair, human hair, that were left behind by people arriving at these camps. Here in the middle, we see watchtowers and barbed wire fences and neatly organized barracks that served as living quarters for the prisoners. In the lower right, one of the means of survival for people during the Nazi era was to hide. And so we've heard stories, of course, Anne Frank, one of the probably more famous stories of hiding underneath the floorboards or in fake rooms behind furniture to just simply survive. And so here's an example of one such hiding place. And in the upper right, we see a selection scene that unfolded over and over again upon arrival at a camp, where some people were directed to go to the left, some to the right, and of course, those who went one way didn't survive, the others did, at least for a while. And so with these visual signifiers in mind, I'd like us to look at some of the cartoons. So here, this one is titled Migrant Hunter, and we have a confrontation scene that happens between a hiding family and most likely President Trump, is signified by his cuffling here and the signature red tie, where he discovers a family hiding underneath the floorboards. So the cartoons, and in this case, quite literally, assign roles to people involved. Some are the hunters and some are the hunted. And those scenes, as I mentioned, played out during the Nazi regime, where those hiding from transportation, quote, developed a routine. If they felt in danger, they would push aside the coffee table and rug in the living room, pull up the floorboards and hide below in a pit. And that is an account from somebody who rescued Jewish families in hiding places. In this modern day selection scene here, we again have some people being directed to the left, some people directed to the right, and a pile of teddy bears that the children rendered upon being separated and then captured and carted away with no indication where. So what the cartoons seem to suggest is that the border crisis, in fact, becomes a contemporary trauma of Holocaust proportions, almost a second Holocaust. And so by relying on these iconic visual signifiers that we all recognize from the collective memory of the Holocaust itself becomes a usable tool in these cartoons, where it gets mobilized as a past trauma to reframe a current situation, another trauma unfolding on the southern border. So, in fact, what I argue in this project is that through the use of hyperbole and analogy, these cartoons rework the border scenario. And again, through de- and recontextualization, President Trump gets reconfigured from a law enforcer, which is what he is at the very beginning of the story, to a supervillain who is being perceived as targeting a certain group of people with very bad intentions in mind. The immigrants, on the other hand, also get de- and recontextualized as they go from lawbreakers, who are seen as entering the country through illegal means, to super victims on the receiving end of this unjust treatment as captured in the cartoons. So these rhetorical transformations also lead to transformations in meanings and functions, where the border crisis, as it was known at the beginning of the coverage, becomes now a crisis in leadership. So the immigrants are no longer the bad guys. I mean, if we're talking about, the archetypal figures, it is now the president and the administration who are the hunters targeting people who are just trying to make a better life, according to these cartoons. So as such, what I think is happening, especially with these cartoons in particular, is that they do offer symbolic punishment to the administration and to the president by reframing the crisis again from a crisis in immigration to a crisis in leadership. So that is kind of the end of my presentation. If anybody would like to continue a conversation about this or other topics, my email address is here, and you can also find me on the School of Communications website. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much, Professor Mielczarek, and I want to invite questions and also comments from those of you who are joining us. If you're on the Zoom webinar, you can see that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can just click that and send us your comments or questions for Professor Mielczarek, and she'll be happy to respond to those. It's really a very fascinating body of research on the role of these memes in internet culture, and also this particular set of case studies that you've given us in order to explain how these memes work. Very moving and really sobering area of study, given the very brutal policies that have existed around borders, and particularly here in the United States recently, and the human cost of that, the impact on families seeking refuge from very dangerous situations abroad. So one of the questions that is certainly worth engaging here has been just some sense of the historical depth that surrounds internet memes. Clearly, these have not always been around. People have engaged with many different forms of media, but how long have internet memes played a very important role societally, given the different histories of media technology that have been influential?
Sure, thank you for the question. So your question specifically asks about internet memes, but if I may just take a slight detour. So this idea of a meme is not new. A meme is basically a piece of cultural knowledge that gets transmitted over time and usually goes through some manipulation and mutation. But internet memes specifically, which of course borrow from that definition, have been really, they started as kind of a non-mainstream piece of communication in the early days of the internet. Believe it or not, I mean, now we have meme websites where you just plug in something and get a meme done for you, but oftentimes they were actually constructed from scratch. So there was an art to it, and it was an artifact that served kind of non-mainstream culture to communicate. So you saw them a lot on 4chan and 8chan, in some corners of Tumblr. So like early social media-ish visual boards, years of the internet. And of course, they kind of became co-opted by the mainstream culture. And now memes, as we know from the body of literature on internet memes, are the most popular visual language of communication online. So it's kind of ironic how they started out as this sort of countercultural tool and became co-opted by the so-called normies, by the mainstream culture, to become a very useful and kind of ubiquitous tool of communication.
Well, can you tell us how experts should think about, or not just experts, but very broad audience should think about the use of images that get circulated and decontextualized and recontextualized, because you started your presentation explaining the difference between the intention that a creator might have with the form of media, its purpose, and then what actually happens in the space between people who are interpreting this and the image or object itself, its function. And there has certainly been a lot of recontextualizing and repurposing of imagery. I'm going to guess this isn't new. You told us the meme itself did not begin with the internet, but the internet did certainly change the way that people were able to work with these media. But what should people think about the use and the reuse and the recontextualization of this? And particularly, what do you think about it as an expert who studies this? Is this changing the way we should understand, for example, intellectual property, the use or control over images? Should we see it more as a healthy democratization of participation in the media world? So what are your thoughts about it?
Well, I don't want to make any enemies here, but and you are right. The idea of and recontextualizing images is not new. It has been around for centuries. I think what is new is the ease and the speed with which it is possible now with the internet and more so with social networking sites. So with the rise of digital photography, we've come to learn that what you see is not always what you get. That's where manipulation comes into play. And again, manipulation, not a new phenomenon, goes back to cave painting days where the painters would exaggerate the shapes of, let's say, the fish they caught or the bison that they hunted. But I think the technology has made these processes much more prevalent, easy, and harder to detect. So I guess when I look at images, the first question, sadly, is this real? Because there is a good possibility that it might not be. And how could you tell? So I think in today's era, when we deal with images and also other artifacts that circulate at such a neck-breaking speed through social networking sites, I think it's good to be a little skeptical and cautious and verify, double check, triple check. That's how we get in trouble with the so-called fake news or other types of fabrication, whether intentional or not. The possibilities are limitless and they are there, and people know how to do it very easily. So I think that would be, I don't know, a caution or maybe a word of warning that when you look at stuff, I think it's always good to verify. And I'm also speaking as a former journalist. That's journalism 101, verify, verify, verify. And that's kind of what fascinates me about this type of work, that people do it and it's so fast that, you see one image and then a couple hours later, it's hundreds of iterations of that image. And sometimes people come to an event through the memes, not through the news photographs that gave us that event. So I think that would be probably the word of caution, to verify and make sure that what you see is truly what you get. And I'm sorry, I forgot. I think there was another part maybe?
No, that was really the substance. And you just said something that anticipates a question from our audience about the source of news that people experience today. And so the question is asking you whether you think that whether you think people are getting their news from memes to some degree, and if you see a relationship between that and the tendency of people to use comedians and entertainers such as Jon Stewart or Trevor Noah or John Oliver as their source of news information.
Well, we know that, and thank you for that question. We know that the younger generation gets a lot of its news from social media. I know this too. I teach introduction to news reporting and writing, and I usually ask my students how they get their news, and I hear social media. So that is how people get their news. Sometimes they don't even know where the news comes from. It's just on Twitter. But if you ask about a source, that's problematic because they just click, because it's all curated and, you know, algorithm and all of that. We all know that. So it is interesting, and I have actually been toying with the idea of looking at how people arrive visually at news, whether it's through the journalistic means of, you know, photographs or videos that we see that spread through news outlets, or through internet memes that just come through their social media feeds. And I don't know the answer. I have not seen work done about that. So maybe that's my cue. I think so. The second part of the question was people relying on like entertainment.
Yeah, particularly the genre of entertainment that is very deliberate and purposeful riff on news, comedic commentary.
Right.
Some of the very popular examples of this are Jon Stewart or Trevor Noah or John Oliver, they're sitting at a desk, and it's sort of similar to a news anchor because there's the little window that hovers next to the person's face, right, and they're flashing up memes or their images, photographs, or something that is based on current news. And they will talk about these news events in order to make some humorous point. But the question is whether you think there's a relationship between a tendency to use internet memes in general as a source of really to serve the purpose that journalism has traditionally served, that is to inform people of contemporary events, with some kind of some lens for interpreting it or understanding it. And if you think there's a relationship between that and the genre of media, comedy rather, that is based on sort of a resemblance to a newscast, but is clearly a comedy show, that right, nevertheless might actually become the way that an audience is learning about contemporary events.
Absolutely. And, you know, the way we came to know memes is through humor. I mean, that was their big function at the sort of, at the beginning. You know, sometimes it's insider humor that we don't understand because we're not a part of some group that would. But as the scholarship on memes has evolved over time, we now know that memes serve many other functions similarly to perhaps those satirical fake news. I'm sorry, I don't mean to use fake news because that usually conjures all kinds of definitions, but I mean mock news programs in a sort of similar way. It is entertainment, but it's also commentary, it's also reaction, it's also coping with, it's also eulogizing, you know, a little boy who died. It's also political participation by protesting something. So that's actually an interesting observation about the parallels. I've never really thought about that, but I can see the similarities in terms of how we kind of entered the space of memes as humorous, but then started using them for different purposes. And perhaps it's the same way with those satirical programs where, yeah, we go to be entertained, but we also learn stuff. And then, you know, a discerning news consumer will obviously not stop there. Will go and check out that information elsewhere to get a well-rounded point of view. And I think that's what memes have become to a lot of people online.
Well, great. Another question here is, do you see the co-opting of memes like these as largely a positive or a negative development, particularly if you think about groups and movements that are committed to positive social change? Do you see the harnessing of memes becoming, having that kind of function? And then there's a related question about whether you think the way people use these memes will become more sophisticated as the technology changes in the future.
I think it already has become pretty sophisticated. You know, in some corners of the internet, sometimes when you do this kind of research, you stumble onto something and then you go down a rabbit hole and you discover this whole new reality where people use memes to communicate often, or not often, but sometimes ideas that kind of go against those that originated the template that they used to produce the meme. I'll give an example in a second. You know, I don't know if it's a question of good or bad or positive or not. I mean, people make use of visual artifacts for whatever, you know, functions they need them. So and I am a big proponent, again, as a former journalist, of free expression. So, you know, that's where the verification comes in, that you need to be smart about interacting with some of these visual artifacts. I know that memes have been used by governments, by businesses, by different marginalized groups, by political operatives. So, you know, is it good or bad? I mean, it just is. And sometimes we see the negatives, sometimes we see the positives. And so, you know, if a meme can spread a positive message, why not? We know that there are plenty of memes that spread not such positive messages out there. And so the example I was going to give was, I don't know if anybody remembers the meme with Pepe the Frog. Pepe the Frog made news in 2016 because Pepe was co-opted by the alt-right and became a symbol in some corners of the internet of that. So I did a pretty intensive study of following how all of that happened online. And, you know, Pepe started as this college kid type on MySpace years and years before. So he was a character in a comic strip. And then people started using him as this meme to comment on life, like kind of, you know, college type kid again, kind of relaxed, going with the flow, and then got co-opted. Was that good or bad? I mean, depends whom you ask, obviously, but it happened. And so we just have to be very careful to understand where these messages are coming from, who is producing them, and for what reasons. So I'll just answer that way, not to be a contrarian, but just simply it's hard to say good or bad. I mean, people are using it for all kinds of functions. So we just have to, be pretty discerning.
Great. And another of our audience members is asking, first thanking you for the presentation and pointing to your reference to early social media platforms, which reminded them of different ways of image distribution. So they asked, do you find differences between posting on platforms such as Twitter and the use of private messaging apps such as WhatsApp? And how do you think your project can inform the study of internet audiences more broadly?
Sure, and thank you also for that question. I have not done research on WhatsApp and similar platforms, so I cannot speak to any differences because I simply haven't studied. It seems to me that, like, from what I have observed, that a lot of the circulation on platforms such as Twitter or Facebook is really a commentary. As I mentioned earlier, memes have become the building blocks of a visual language. So oftentimes you see just the meme without any textual commentary because the meme sums it up enough to provide some kind of a reaction or thought or maybe expression of political engagement, whatever the function is. So I'm sorry, but I cannot answer like the second half of the question because I have no comparison because I have not studied. It would be interesting, but I would have to figure out how to get access to private messages since they are private and very directional.
Yeah. That makes sense. So very helpful. And of course, as you referred to earlier, you have a decade's worth of experience as a journalist. And so you're now studying this form of media, but you've also worked as someone who is a professional in media to convey information in this very expert manner. So I'm wondering if you can relay to us some of the insights that you've gleaned about how journalism may have changed over the years as a result of the influence of these types of internet memes and social media more broadly. Or maybe you think it hasn't really changed. Has it become more important for professional journalism to try to differentiate itself and sort of remain apart from the flurry of transformation that's happening in the social media world? What would you say based on your experience?
Sure, thank you. So I left the everyday practice of journalism in late 2010. So it's been a while, but I still have friends who are practicing journalists, so I keep up that way. And
you also study it still.
And I also study it, and like the basics of journalism 101 have not changed. I mean, the pursuit of truth and facts and well-rounded reporting are still at the heart of the profession. When I left, the idea of the so-called citizen journalist was very popular, and I even thought of studying that in graduate school in my doctoral program. I didn't, obviously. I went into the visual communication field, but so there was a tension between professional journalists who were schooled in how to report, how to write, what sources to include, who sort of were brought up that way, versus citizen journalists who were just anybody with a camera who could type and then relay to others what happened. I think what we see now is a kind of a combination of both. A lot of news outlets rely on people and their accounts. I mean, that's how, you know, we know what happened to George Floyd, for example. We have the video. There was not a professional journalist, but there was a person who had a smartphone and recorded the young woman who did. So, so I think there is this symbiotic relationship between people who are not professional, yet understand what it takes to cover a community, and then the professionals who understand the business, understand the legacy in different ways than Jane Smith would, you know, who is a blogger without the corporate ties, without the legacy that rests on some on these institutions. You know, as I teach reporting and writing, I find myself every year really updating the way students can access sources. It used to be that going through social media was kind of rare at the, you know, at the very beginning. Now it's a must. You have to check out the social media presence of your sources because that's how you get information. Sometimes that is the only way to have a conversation with your source when you direct message somebody because they don't respond to anything else. So I think there is a lot more for journalists, however we define whether, you know, institution journalist or not, to check with and account for, because people self mass communicate through these portals, and it's no longer a phone, it's no longer a Rolodex. Probably nobody really knows anymore what that is. It's now Twitter, it's now direct messaging, it's now all these different platforms that you have to kind of be up on because that's where people communicate. So it's a lot more work too, because you need to be up on it, you need to be constantly monitoring, and that takes time.
Yes, it does. Well, this has been fascinating, really enlightening to learn about the important ways that images and messages are being conveyed, particularly within the context of internet memes. And you're sharing with us your research on what you've really appropriately named here, the lives of pictures beyond publication. So thank you so much, Professor Natalia Mielczarek, and thanks so much for our audience for joining us, for your questions and comments as well. And please look out for our upcoming continuing series of research colloquia that are showcasing some of the fascinating work that's happening with our faculty in the College of the Arts and Human Sciences here at Virginia Tech. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much.